Bel and Nebo. Bel and Nebo were the two supreme deities of Babylon. And to understand why Isaiah's attack on them matters, you need to understand what Babylon actually was. This was not a minor regional power. This was the most feared empire on earth. Its army had leveled Jerusalem, burned the temple to the ground, and deported the entire population of Judah into captivity. Its gods were not the gods of a defeated people. They were the gods of the nation that had just destroyed the people of Yahweh. And into that context, with Israel sitting in exile, surrounded by the overwhelming evidence that Babylon's gods had won, Isaiah opens his mouth and mocks them. Bel was a title, meaning Lord, applied to Marduk, the chief god of the empire. Nebo, known in Babylonian texts as Nabu, was the god of wisdom, writing, and destiny, depicted holding a stylus, the divine scribe who recorded human fate. His temple in Borsippa was a major center of scribal education. The names of Babylonian kings were built around these gods. Nebuchadnezzar contains Nabu. Belshazzar contains Bel. Isaiah 46:1 mocks them both with surgical precision. Bel bows down, Nebo stoops low. Their idols are borne by beasts of burden. This is a direct satirical reference to the Babylonian New Year procession, in which the statues of Bel and Nebo were carried through the city streets by animals in elaborate ceremony. Isaiah's point is devastating in its simplicity. A god that must be carried by a donkey cannot carry anyone. Yahweh, in the very next verse, says, "I have made you, and I will carry you." When Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BC, both gods began their decline into irrelevance within generations. Queen of Heaven. The Queen of Heaven is referenced in Jeremiah 7:18 and 44:17-19. And what makes her entry in Scripture remarkable is not just what she was, but how her worshippers defended her. When Jeremiah confronted the women of Judah for baking cakes in her image, burning incense, and pouring out drink offerings to her, they pushed back, directly, aggressively. They told Jeremiah that their lives had been prosperous when they worshipped her, and that disaster had only come when they stopped. They had constructed a theology that credited a pagan goddess with their well-being and blamed Yahweh's prophets for their suffering. Stop and consider what that means. These were not foreigners. These were covenant people, people who knew the Torah, who had heard the prophets, who had seen Jerusalem stand through Assyrian siege. And they were standing in front of Jeremiah arguing that a Babylonian fertility goddess deserved the credit for their survival. That is not ignorance. That is a fully formed alternative theology, built over generations of quiet compromise. Most scholars identify the Queen of Heaven as Ishtar or Astarte, celestial mother goddesses, associated with the moon, stars, and the fertility cycles of life. Her worship was domestic, household level, led by women, woven into the fabric of daily life. That is precisely what made it so dangerous. This was not a dramatic public act of apostasy. It was quiet idolatry practiced around kitchen fires in ordinary homes across Judah, passed from mothers to daughters across generations until it felt completely normal. Jeremiah warned that this devotion would bring the full weight of divine judgment on Jerusalem. The city fell to Babylon not long afterward. Tammuz. Tammuz was a Mesopotamian fertility god, known in Sumerian texts as Dumuzi, whose mythology described him as a young deity who died each year with the dry season and returned with the rains. His death was mourned annually in a widespread religious ritual in which worshippers, particularly women, wept and lamented to encourage his resurrection and the renewal of the land. In Ezekiel chapter 8, the prophet is shown a series of escalating abominations occurring inside the Jerusalem temple itself. Each vision is worse than the last. Among them, women sitting at the north gate of the temple, weeping for Tammuz, not in a foreign city, not in a pagan shrine on a hilltop, inside the Jerusalem temple. This was Babylonian fertility religion operating at the very heart of Yahweh's sacred space, practiced by Israelite women who saw no contradiction between mourning a Mesopotamian death god and worshiping the God of Israel. Here is what makes this passage uniquely disturbing. Ezekiel is not describing a nation that has abandoned Yahweh and replaced him with Tammuz. He is describing a nation that has kept Yahweh and added Tammuz, a nation so spiritually desensitized that Babylonian mourning rituals felt like a normal part of temple life. The corruption was not dramatic. It was gradual. One generation absorbed the practice. The next generation inherited it. By the time Ezekiel arrived, it had been there long enough to feel traditional. Tammuz is the clearest illustration in all of Scripture of how idolatry actually works. It rarely announces itself. It absorbs into existing practice gradually, slowly, until pagan ritual feels indistinguishable from faithful worship. If this channel is giving you biblical history at a depth you have never found anywhere else, hit subscribe right now. There is a full library of videos built exactly like this one, and every one of them will change the way you read Scripture. You are already halfway through part 2. Stay with it. The Divine Council. This is one of the most theologically significant and least discussed concepts in the entire Old Testament, and it is the key that unlocks everything you saw in part 1. Psalm 82:1 states, God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. The word translated gods here is Elohim, the same Hebrew word used for Yahweh himself, applied in this context to a category of spiritual beings who held real authority. These beings are rebuked in the same psalm for perverting justice and showing partiality to the wicked. They are told they will die like mortals because of their failures. Deuteronomy 32:8, preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls version, states that when Yahweh divided the nations at Babel, he assigned them according to the number of the sons of God, placing spiritual beings over the Gentile nations while taking Israel as his own direct portion. Job 1:6 describes these sons of God presenting themselves before Yahweh with the Satan, meaning the adversary, among them. Here is the detail that rewrites everything. If Deuteronomy 32:8 is correct, and the Dead Sea Scrolls version is the oldest manuscript evidence we have, then every nation on earth was assigned to a spiritual being at Babel. Baal was not just a Canaanite superstition. Chemosh was not just a Moabite tradition. Marduk was not just Babylonian mythology. According to the Bible's own internal framework, real powers stood behind those names, powers that accepted worship, directed nations, and accumulated authority that was never theirs to take. The false gods of the ancient world were not nothing. They were a hijack, and the entire Old Testament is the story of Yahweh taking back what was stolen. This framework fundamentally changes how to read every false god covered in part 1 and part 2. The Bible is not saying the gods of the nations were simply human inventions with nothing behind them. It is saying that real spiritual powers operated behind those idols, powers that had rebelled against Yahweh's order, accepted the worship of nations that should have been directed to him, and would be judged accordingly. Baal, Chemosh, Merodach, these were not just cultural symbols. According to the biblical worldview, they were the visible faces of invisible rebellious powers who had claimed authority over the nations they had no right to hold. Psalm 82 ends with the declaration that Yahweh will inherit all nations, a direct reversal of the Deuteronomy 32 arrangement. The false gods of the nations are not just condemned in Scripture, they are sentenced. Nisroch. The gods in this series have been exposed as powerless in many ways, silent on Mount Carmel, prostrate before the ark, carried through the streets on donkeys. But Nisroch's failure is in a category of its own. Nisroch was the Assyrian god in whose temple King Sennacherib was murdered by his own sons. The context is essential. Sennacherib had besieged Jerusalem during Hezekiah's reign, demanding surrender and publicly mocking Yahweh in letters delivered directly to the king. His field commander stood outside Jerusalem's walls and shouted to the population in Hebrew, their own language, that no god had ever delivered a nation from Assyria, and Yahweh would be no different. 2 Kings 19:35 recorded that a single angel of Yahweh struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in the camp that night. Sennacherib retreated to Nineveh in humiliation. While worshiping in the temple of Nisroch, his sons Adramelech and Sharezer killed him. The most powerful king of his generation, who had publicly challenged the living God, was assassinated in the sanctuary of his own deity, the God who was supposed to protect him, unable to protect him from his own family. Scholars believe Nisroch may have been a variant of Ninurta, the Mesopotamian god of war and agriculture. His precise identity is debated. What the biblical account makes unmistakably clear is the theological verdict. The god offered no protection whatsoever to the man who relied on him. Nephilim, before the flood, before the Exodus, before the conquest of Canaan, the Bible records something that most teachers skip entirely, and the reason they skip it is because it raises questions that do not have comfortable answers. Genesis 6:1-4 describes sons of God taking human wives and producing offspring called the Nephilim, described as mighty men of renown, legendary for their power and violence. Their presence is directly connected to the catastrophic moral corruption that preceded Noah's flood. The text implies their existence was both a symptom and an accelerant of humanity's collapse. The sons of God have been interpreted three ways across Jewish and Christian tradition: fallen angels who took human wives, the godly line of Seth intermarrying with ungodly women, or ancient rulers whose power warranted divine titles. The oldest Jewish interpretation, reflected in the Book of Enoch, which predates the New Testament, understood them as fallen angels. Jude 6 and 2 Peter 2:4 both reference angelic beings who abandoned their proper dwelling as examples of divine judgment, appearing to confirm this reading. The Nephilim appear again in Numbers 13:33, where Israelite spies returning from Canaan report encountering them and describe themselves as grasshoppers by comparison. Whether this was literal or rhetorical exaggeration born of fear, the text uses it to explain the spies' refusal to trust Yahweh's promise, directly resulting in 40 years of wilderness wandering. What connects the Nephilim to every other false god in this series is the divine council framework. If spiritual beings were assigned authority over the nations, and if some of those beings rebelled and exceeded their boundaries, then the Nephilim represent the most extreme expression of that rebellion. Not gods worshipped at a distance, powers that cross the boundary between the spiritual and physical worlds entirely, producing offspring whose violence helped push humanity to the point of no return. The flood was not just a judgment on human sin, it was a reset of a world that had been comprehensively corrupted at every level. Rimmon. Rimmon was the Syrian storm god, almost certainly the same deity known as Hadad across the West Semitic world. His name derives from the Aramaic word for thunderer, as the god believed to control rain and thunder in a region entirely dependent on seasonal rainfall. Rimmon was central to Syrian national religion and deeply embedded in political life. He appears in 2 Kings chapter 5 through one of the most humanly relatable moments in the entire Old Testament. Naaman, the Syrian army commander, has just been miraculously healed of leprosy by the prophet Elisha and pledges himself exclusively to Yahweh. Then he immediately raises a problem. In his official duties as the king's right-hand man, he will be required to escort the king into Rimmon's temple and bow alongside him during state ceremonies. He asks for Yahweh's pardon in advance. Elisha's response, "Go in peace," has been debated by theologians for centuries, but the passage itself captures something that most ancient religious texts never address: the genuine tension between authentic faith and the impossible demands of living inside a political system built entirely around false gods. Naaman's question is not the question of a hypocrite. It is the question of a man trying to live faithfully in a world that will not accommodate his faith. Gad and Meni. Isaiah 65:11 delivers a targeted rebuke to Israelites who forsake Yahweh and spread a table for Gad and fill cups of mixed wine for Meni. Gad was a god of fortune, the divine force behind luck, chance, and material prosperity. Meni was a god of fate and destiny. His name derived from the Hebrew verb meaning to apportion, reflecting his role as the deity who measured out each person's portion in life. Together, they represented the oldest and most persistent of all religious temptations, the desire to secure the future by appealing to luck and fate, rather than submitting to a sovereign god whose ways cannot be manipulated. Gad and Meni required no moral transformation, no covenant obligations, no ethical demands, just offerings, a table set, cups of wine poured, in exchange for fortune and a favorable destiny. Isaiah's rebuke lands hardest because Gad and Meni are the least dramatic false gods across both parts of this series. No fire rituals, no temple prostitution, no child sacrifice, just ordinary people, quietly placing their hope in chance and fate rather than in the promises of God. Every god covered across these two videos, from the bronze arms of Molech to the wine poured for Meni, represents the same fundamental act, taking the trust, the devotion, and the future that belong to Yahweh and directing it somewhere else. The Bible's verdict on all of them is identical. They will bow, they will be silenced, and the God they displaced will inherit every nation they were ever given. Every god on this list had one thing in common. People gave them what they were only ever supposed to give to Yahweh: their trust, their resources, and their future. If you want to go deeper on what Scripture actually says about the spiritual powers behind these idols and how they operated, the next video breaks down the divine council in full detail. It is linked on screen right now. Watch it next.